If there's a war, Russia knows it can win, not just Vladimir Putin, but everyone. It's a war on Russia's doorstep. It's a war in eastern Ukraine or even in western Ukraine, because you're talking about a force that can be built up and then ultimately commutes to the fight. Who cannot win in Ukraine? We can't. We're too far away. We can't mass the forces. We can't build up to do anything. And the Europeans, they lack both the resolve, the will, and the understanding to field a force that could defeat the Russians. So it's all nonsense. It's a dead end. We can't win it. Now, I think privately there have been moments of lucidity when Donald Trump has effectively said that. When he said in the Oval Office to Zelensky, you don't have any cards to play. What he didn't know is that his donors were on Zelensky's team, and his donors were going to tell him, you have to stick with this, Donald, because his donors, these are the ones driving us to war with Iran, driving us to war with anybody Israel doesn't like, also hate Russia. Okay, it's not an American interest. But whose payroll are all of these people on? That's the question you have to ask. I wish every time Fox or CNN or somebody brings up an individual and puts the name up there, they should put beneath it sources of income. What are the sources of income? Well, it's probably Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, APAC, or some derivative of APAC. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Who is funding these talking heads? If Americans understood that, they would step back in horror and suddenly realize that none of these people are saying or doing anything that is in the interest of the United States. And frankly, this has been the problem from the very beginning. I saw this back in the 90s. The view was, it doesn't matter. We can sell our country down the road because it doesn't hurt us. We're great, we're powerful, no one can ever touch us, nothing can ever harm us. So what difference does it make? What difference does it make if another few million illegals come into the country? What difference does it make if we embroil ourselves in conflicts in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, or Eastern Europe? Because we're great, we're powerful, nobody can challenge us, nobody can touch us. Well, that's wrong. It's dead wrong. And we are more vulnerable today than ever in our history. We have created a situation of extreme danger to the United States, not just militarily, but financially and economically. You know, someone was talking to me earlier today and said, you know, the problem, Doug, and this is someone overseas who's very heavily engaged in the banking industry. He said, you know, when people look at us and at the United States, and then they look at China, they conclude very quickly that China's economy, which has doubled, tripled in size since 2005, given its population, given the successful implementation of state-sponsored capitalism in China, even though China has a great deal of debt, just as we do, everyone is confident that the Chinese economy is going to outgrow its debt. No one believes, based upon what they're seeing inside the United States today, that the United States has any chance whatsoever of growing out of its debt. Absolutely not. And so the world is moving away from us into this thing called BRICS. And that puts everything at risk. So my point is that the people talking in these terms are not only dangerously wrong, they're putting the country in severe jeopardy. Because what we need now, more than ever before in our history, is peace and stability. The stability that comes from peace, that is the foundation for prosperity. We need to dump all of this overseas and look very carefully at what we need to do here at home to rebuild our economy, rebuild this financial system to make sense, to end the financialization of our economy, to start producing and building things, which we have not done for decades.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And in order to make that vision come to pass, you got to have a leader with the courage to make hard decisions. And unfortunately, President Trump, even though he came into office with that reputation, certainly has not produced. And I want to show kind of a graphic contrast, if you will. You mentioned a minute ago that Oval Office meeting in late February where President Trump had that big blow up with Zelensky and told him you don't have cards and you don't have leverage, et cetera. Had he acted on what you said he should have done in January and just said, all right, here's the deal. This is over. Our support is going to come to an end on this date unless you come to an agreement that we can live with, or you're on your own if you want to fight. That's what should have happened then. You said that many times. But instead, after this now, all these months later, now into November, this 28-point peace plan that he comes up with, now then that's been shredded. And you heard the parliament member there in Ukraine, after meeting with Trump's negotiators, said that none of the issues you wanted are on the table. And then last night, here's what Zelensky is now saying.
Ukraine is not alone, and this is important. Our teams have already reported today on the new draft of steps, and this is truly the right approach. Sensitive issues. Delicate issues I discuss with President Trump. Ukraine will never be an obstacle to peace. This is our principle, a common principle. And millions of Ukrainians expect and deserve a decent peace. We will do everything for this. We're ready to work as quickly as possible, and we also understand how many interests surround Ukraine. And above all, there is an interest from Russia in derailing this chance for an agreement and in prolonging the war.
So he's trying to tell everybody, and of course he's been meeting with a lot of Europeans as well, that, hey, it's the Russians who are the problem, and they don't want the deal that we want, and we'll have peace as long as they're on our terms, which means, correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that whatever President Trump intended, it's Zelensky and his European leaders who are running the show.
Zelensky and his government are not only a catalyst for conflict with Russia in a permanent sense. Frankly, they are responsible for the conflict. And until that government is gone, there will be no peace in Ukraine or Russia. And that's where we are headed right now. People need to understand this. I think they do, frankly, outside of Ukraine. I think there are preparations to fly Zelensky and much of his inner circle to Israel, where they have immunity against extradition for criminal proceedings, and that's what they're going to need when they finish up in Ukraine. They've got one foot right now in Ukraine and the other foot really in the door of the aircraft to fly them out. People don't realize how weak and fragile this Ukrainian government is. Earlier today, I received some information from Eastern Europe, and I was told that people are coming out of the basements and homes in Prokhovsk, and they're saying, to the Russians, thank God, let's get this over with, help end this war. And many of them are saying what initially back in 2022 in February, March, April, we're saying in Luhansk and Donetsk, what took you so long? I think increasingly the population that lives in Eastern Ukraine and much of the population in the West desperately wants an end to this war. And they realize it will only end with one outcome. That is the elimination of Zelensky and his regime. It's a permanent trigger for conflict and war. Now that satisfies certain people in Washington, D.C. and the current globalist governments in Europe, but it is not a long-term solution for peace and stability in Europe. It's the opposite. So people like McConnell or Slotkin or Lindsey Graham, any of these people, they all sing the same tune. Somebody was saying the other day, well, the Republicans have made such a mess of this, the Democrats are going to end up taking over on the midterms, and then they'll probably win in 28. And I looked at them and I said, so what difference? What's the difference? That's the truth. These people are all playing more or less on the same team. And that's why you've got to go back and ask the question, how is it that you're a millionaire? How did you become a millionaire after you came to Washington, D.C.? Show us the sources of your cash. Pretty soon you discover it's the same source, the same people.
And you have to look at the European contingent this minute. You mentioned them a second ago, but again, this it seems to me that Ukraine and Europe are driving the train. You said it should be the United States. We have the power, but it doesn't look like it is. So on top of everything I've already shown you here now, kind of representing the European side, is Keir Starmer yesterday before members of his parliament, or maybe it's this morning.
And Mr. Speaker, we should not forget that Putin's aggression, his illegal actions, and his total disregard for human life has taken a huge toll on his own people. Thousands of Russian soldiers are killed every single day. 100,000 have been killed attacking Donetsk. In total, more than 1 million Russians have been killed or injured, all because of the depraved ambitions of one man. So, Mr. Speaker, we say again, this country will never falter in our support for the Ukrainian people. We will maintain a unity of purpose with our allies, and we will focus on delivering the calm, serious leadership that is needed to advance a just and lasting peace for Ukraine and indeed for the whole of Europe.
Doug, seriously, that speech could have been given on the first year of war when Biden was in office. I mean, they're virtually indistinguishable, meaning there's no change, as you just said.
Well, these are all lies. And the lies are the foundation for the failed policies that he and his colleagues in Europe have pursued. If he admits that the Russian losses are minuscule compared with the enormous losses of the Ukrainians, well, that undermines his argument. It would be the humane thing for him to do because he's just flat out lying. None of that is true. It reminds me of the commitments that were made by Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill that said Poland will be a free, independent, democratic state at the end of this war. Well, you know what happened? No such thing. It's almost as ridiculous as Gerald Ford, who during his bid for election, when he ran for president after having succeeded Nixon, said that Poland will never be a Soviet satellite under a Ford administration. And of course, it had been a Soviet satellite since the end of the Second World War. Politicians lie all the time. They lie when it's impossible to do anything else because the truth is too dangerous. The truth is too destructive. Starmer is in a lot of trouble. He is the most universally hated person in the British Isles. He's not going to last. And frankly, Britain is in very serious financial as well as political trouble. If it all comes together, we could see something on the scale of the English Civil Wars. I commend everybody to listen to David Betts, who's studied the potential for revolutionary change in Great Britain now for many years, and his more recent works give great detail in support of what I've just said. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to Starmer. Macron won't be far behind, and neither will be Merz in Berlin. These people are all on the road to extinction.
You know, part of the problem on Britain, I'll just kind of take a side street on this one, that you say there's a lot of political problems inside of UK. It's always been for decades and decades, it's been conservatives and labor kind of going back and forth here. But now that the conservatives and labor are kind of falling off on their own, going off onto one side here, where this now growing from the people from the bottom up is kind of bubbling up. And to show how disconnected they are from that is that the opposition leader, the conservative opposition leader, went also right after Starmer spoke to take issue with what he said. But you'll see that the issue that they took was that he's not going far enough.
Conservatives are clear that the blanket surrender of Ukrainian territory would mean rewarding Putin's unprovoked aggression. What is the government's position on reports that Ukraine's territorial integrity is on the table? Because if Putin is seen to emerge stronger from these negotiations, all our potential adversaries will be emboldened. Be in no doubt, Mr. Speaker, the axis of authoritarian states is collaborating to destabilize the West, aided by China, with Iran providing weapons and North Korea providing troops for Putin. It is precisely for these reasons that the government must continue to work extremely closely with the US and to understand their objectives. Parties like the Lib Dems and the Greens, who are encouraging us to decouple from the US, are putting their anti-American prejudice above national security.
So, I mean, they want to just decouple from anything that's going to take away from the gravy train, as I see it. How do you see it?
Well, Britain has fallen on very hard times. None of these people are particularly competent, and it's unfortunate they seem to be suffering from a talent deficit as bad or worse than our own. Let me give you a quick example. In 1863, when Denmark declared war on Prussia and Austria over a territorial dispute, there was suddenly an outburst of patriotic fervor in England saying we should send our army to the Danish peninsula and help the Danes fight the Prussians and the Austrians. There was a very brilliant prime minister who came to power at the time. His name was Palmerston, a serious conservative and thoughtful man. And Palmerston said very cleverly to the gathered body, we know that we can send 100,000 of our troops, which would have been virtually the whole British army, to Denmark, and they would give a good account of themselves, to which everybody said, hear, 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 you know. He said, however, we also realize that however much we may like the Danes and want to help them, that 100,000 British troops are not going to rescue the Danes from eventual defeat by the Prussians and the Austrians. In fact, if we were to do this, the Prussians and the Austrians would mobilize their respective armed forces and their nations, and we could not compete with that. So it makes no sense for us to join this conflict. Now, stop and think about that. This is 1863. The British Empire in 1863 was far larger, far more powerful, far more extensive than British power today is, dramatically so. And yet that prime minister had the common sense and the intelligence to recognize the limitations of British power. And he knew that in 1863, together with the Danes, there was no chance of success against Prussia and Austria. We need more people with common sense and willingness to tell the truth in public. Instead, we have these false narratives that have been cooked up, for years by MI6. We're talking about a level of control over the media, influence over the media, influence over what is discussed or isn't discussed in the West that really is worse than what I remember studying about the Soviets in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. That's pretty frightening if you stop and think about it. They have successfully crushed anyone who challenges anything in the narrative that they insist is true. It's not going to last much longer. The British, surprisingly, have proved as a population to be remarkably obedient, but it's coming to an end. I think we're going to see it end across Europe. And obviously people will sit out there and say, well, Doug, you said these things before. Yes, I have. And it's going to happen. But remember, the world is not an American microwave oven. You say something, Americans, oh, well, that's happened now. It'll happen next week. If you tell Americans that if we go into Venezuela, that this could fatally damage us financially and economically, that it could undermine our position as the financial hegemon in the Western world, they say, oh, well, that's ridiculous. How could that happen? But when it does happen in 6 months or 8 months or 9 months, whatever it turns out to be, everybody says, well, how could this have ever occurred? Why didn't we see this coming? It's coming. Europe is going to fall apart and it's going to rebuild itself. It's going to be tough. It's going to be ugly. But eventually there will be new governments, and these new governments are going to be completely disinterested in any war with Russia under any circumstances. That's coming. Moscow knows it, and the Russians know it, and the Russians are going to complete the job. And this 28-point plan is absurd. You might as well print it on toilet paper because that's the best use for it at this point.
Well, and you mentioned the Russians. Yeah, also, you mentioned people being unable or unwilling to acknowledge the truth, and then the Russians who are willing to say what the reality is. The interesting thing to me is that in light of all of these physical realities, because everything always goes back to what's happening on the ground and the actual balance of power as opposed to just words, is remaining on the Russian side. And even with all the advantages actually on their side, you don't hear them coming out and blasting a lot of words of their own. In fact, you have Sergei Lavrov, who actually says, even after all this, even with this 28 and now 19-point plan, whatever it is, because we haven't seen the details yet, he's still saying we're willing to talk. However,
Our assessment remains valid in the sense that the key provisions of Trump's plan are based on the understandings reached in Anchorage at the Russian-American summit in August of this year. And these principles are generally reflected in the plan, which we welcomed. President Putin mentioned this because after Anchorage, when we thought these understandings had already been formalized, there was a long pause, and now the pause has been interrupted by the introduction of this document. We have it, but it has not been officially transmitted to us through unofficial channels. But we are naturally ready, as the President said, to discuss specific wording, because a number of issues there, of course, require clarification.
And what their President Putin has said in wearing military fatigues the other day in front of his military guys, he said, we will accomplish all of our military objectives, all of them, either by negotiations or by military. So that's where the Russians seem to be. What is that going to manifest on the ground?
Well, we've already seen a lot of evidence that the pace of operations has picked up. We now know that Russian forces have between themselves and the Dnieper River essentially open rolling terrain. The ball is truly in Russia's court. Moscow has to decide what it wants to do. The longer the stupidity drags on in Western Europe, the more threats that are made against Russia, the more likely it is that the Russians conclude that the only safety they can aspire to is the complete taking of territory up to the Dnieper River, because they'll see the Dnieper River as a natural barrier, a natural defensive line. That's what they'll do. And I still say that whatever happens, they will end up with both Odessa and Kharkov that are historically Russian cities, not Ukrainian. And when those cities are in their hands, they may be willing to talk about alternatives to the status quo, but not much until they get there. So I think the Russians now have the ability to end this by the end of the year on terms that they find acceptable. They would prefer what I discussed earlier, for these governments in London and Paris and Berlin to change, and they may. There's a real potential for that. But in the meantime, they're just going to have to press ahead, and they can expect nothing from us. And by the way, the interesting part is, President Trump has largely walked away from this business. I mean, he's willing to say, here's a 28-point plan, go look at it. But he's not really interested in it. Why is he not really interested? Because he can't be at the center of it. Remember, President Trump's all about optics. If this does not create the illusion that he wants, that somehow or another he's settled his, whatever it is, 19th war, whatever count he's aspiring to. Yeah. If he can't say that, then he's not really interested anyway. So I think he'll play it off, which is what he's effectively done with these promises of more military assistance to Ukraine. Most of that material will not arrive for a year, 2 years, or longer. By the time that happens, there won't be a Ukraine unless somebody wakes up quickly and recognizes that they need a new government in Kiev, and the one that's there is a permanent obstacle to peace. Who knows? Everything is possible. It's not impossible. Something like that could happen. But right now, the Russians have to assume no change in the near term, which means they march west.